Respected teacher and my dear friends, my name is Swati Shashi. I am from Group 7. The Group 7 is going to present a video on the topic tribal land. First, I would like to introduce my group members Agila Lovis, Anushree K, Aryan Romi, CB George, Jayadevan NK, Nasiba, and Swati Shashi includes our group. Swati Shashi deals with the introduction part, tribal land and legislation, and overview at the national level handled by CB George. Tribal land in Kerala, a topic which is going to present by Agila Lovis. Act related to tribal land will take by Nasiba. Intensity of tribal land problems will handle by Jayadevan, and Aryan Romi will present the case laws. Then Anushree K will conclude our presentation. Let me enter into the introduction. We can see some definitions on what is tribe. The Imperial Gazette of India 1911 defines a tribe as a collection of families bearing a common name, speaking a common dialect, occupying or professing to occupy a common territory, and is not usually endogamous, though originally it might have been so. Another definition of tribe is by D. N. Majumdar. He defines a tribe is a collection of families or group of families bearing a common name, members of which occupy the same territory, speak the same language, and observe certain taboos regarding marriage, profession, or occupation, and have developed a well assessed system of reciprocity and mutuality of obligations. According to studies of the anthropological literature, it appears that the term tribe has been used for those groups of human beings whose place of residence is situated in remote areas like hills, forest, sea coast, and islands, and whose style of life is quite different from the present day civilized men. Local indigenous people residing in these places of the world are termed a tribe or tribal to distinguish from other people of the world. India is one of the few nations in the world with a thriving tribal population in different parts of the country. There are 537 different tribal communities spread all over India. As per official data, 258 tribal communities speaking about 106 different languages are notified as scheduled tribes. As per the 1991 census, the tribal population is 6.77 crore, comprising about 8.08% of the total population of the country. Madhya Pradesh has the largest tribal population with 1.54 crore, followed by Maharashtra with 0.73 crore and Orissa with 0.70 crore. About 82% of the total tribal population is concentrated in central and western parts of the country, whereas only 11% is dispersed in small pockets in the southern states. The tribal population is increasing along with the Indian population but at a rate lower than the general population. This indicates that there is no systematic persecution. In India, even though tribes are in better situation than their counterparts in foreign lands does not mean that they become part better margins of general Indian society and thriving. Like any other tribes, Indian tribes also face various threats and challenges. The areas inhabited by tribal constitute a significant part of the underdeveloped areas of the country. The tribals live mostly in isolated villages or hamlets. A smaller portion of their population has now settled in permanent villages as well as in towns and cities. The concentration of tribal people is in all states and union territories in India except the state of Haryana, Punjab, Delhi, and Chandigarh. The predominant tribal populated states of the country are Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, and Union Territories of Dadra Nagar Haveli and Lakshadweep. While the Indian Constitution guarantees property rights to all, it enshrines special protections for land rights of scheduled tribes vis-à-vis the state and other communities in geographically demarcated tribal majority areas known as scheduled areas under the 5th and 6th schedules of the Constitution. The currently designated 5th scheduled areas are in the states of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Himachal Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Orissa, and Rajasthan. The currently designated 6th scheduled areas are in the northeastern states of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Mizoram. The scheduled tribes or Adivasis consist of a number of heterogeneous tribal groups that have historically self-identified and been identified by the British colonial and independent Indian states as lying outside the mainstream of Hindu society, partially because of their distinctive culture and way of life as a group, and partially because of their geographical isolation. Currently, there are 750 tribes in India. The Constitution guarantees special protection for land rights of scheduled tribes in scheduled areas because land is not only the most important source of tribal livelihood, but it is also central to their community identity, history, and culture. Many non-scheduled areas states have also created legal protection for protecting land rights of tribals. Despite this special protection, scheduled tribes remain one of the most vulnerable, most impoverished, and most displaced of all groups in India. 47.1% of all STs in rural areas are below the poverty line as compared to 33.8% for the national average, whereas 28.8% of all the STs in urban areas are below the poverty line as compared to 20.9% for the national average. In spite of being the only In spite of being the only group with constitutional protections for their land rights, 9.4% of STs are constitute only 8.6% of the total population. It is estimated that they constitute 40% of all people who have been displaced during the period 1951 to 1990, some more than once due to the construction of dams, mines, industrial developments, and the creation of wildlife parks and sanctuaries. Only 24.7% of ST population that was displaced during this period was rehabilitated. Therefore, it is clear that these groups have disproportionately borne the burden of economic development. To protect and safeguarding the land rights of tribes and to address the issues of land acquisition and displacement of tribals, there are certain constitutional provisions and acts exist in both central and state level. For example, the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act 2006, Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013. Constitutional provisions under Schedule 5 also provide for safeguards against displacement of tribal population because of land acquisitions, etc. This assignment is a humble attempt to test the in-depth details of tribal land laws exist in India and Kerala. You can learn more about tribal lands through the other presentations coming. Over to Sibi sir. Thank you.
Hello, I'm CB George. I will briefly cover the topic tribal land, an overview at the national level. Have we ever thought how the tribal people got the title scheduled tribe? It was by chance rather than by design. The tribes were listed under Schedule 5 and 6 of the Constitution, so they came to be known as scheduled tribe. I'll use a few PowerPoint slides to cover my presentation. Article 366 of the Constitution defines scheduled tribes as tribes or tribal communities as are deemed under Article 342. Article 342 of the Constitution defines who would be scheduled tribes, that is, those tribes or tribal communities that are scheduled as such by a presidential order. Subsequently, the tribes have been identified through a number of presidential orders. According to the 2011 census, the tribal population in India is approximately 104 millions, or about 8.6% of the total population. The table here shows the list of important tribes in India, that is, tribes with more than 5 lakh in population, and the states giving the place of habitation. For example, the tribe listed at the top, that is the Bhil tribe, is seen in the states of Tripura, Andhra Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra and Karnataka. Similarly, the other important tribes have been listed out. This slide shows the census data, that is from 1951 to 2011, the tribal population in lakhs and the percentage of total population. For example, in 1951, there was 6.23%, which increased to 8.61 as in 2011. The figure here shows the spread or the distribution of tribal population across the country. The red shade shows the minimum, that is 6% and below, which goes up to 40% and above, shown by the green shade. It is interesting to note that in 2 states in the north, the tribal population is nil. Now let us see the important legislations for the protection of tribal land. It includes the Scheduled Castes and the Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989, the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006, which is also known as the Forest Rights Act, the Panchayats Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996, which is also known as the PESA Act, and the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013, which is also popularly known as the LARA Act. Now, what are the important goals of these legislations and the legal framework? It includes to safeguard the tribals from atrocities, to punish the offenders, to recognize and vest the forest rights in forest-dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers, to make special provisions relating to the extension of the Panchayati Raj system to scheduled areas, to ensure participative and transparent process for land acquisition, and as a safeguard for the scheduled tribes, no acquisition of land shall be made in the scheduled areas, and where such acquisition does take place, it shall be done only as a last resort, to empower the Gram Sabhas constitutionally. The National Commission for Scheduled Tribes was established through the Constitution 89th Amendment Act 2003. The duties and responsibilities of this commission include ensure full implementation of the provision of various laws and legislations, investigate and monitor all matters relating to the safeguards provided, safeguard the rights of the tribal communities over the forest resources, relief and rehabilitation measures for tribal groups, to prevent alienation of tribal people from land, and to effectively rehabilitate such people in whose case alienation has taken place. Now we have seen the important legislations and the legal framework.
Let us see the challenges in their practical implementation. We see that often legislations remain strong on paper and weak on ground. While the authorities preach that they are the protectors of tribal land, on the other hand, their actions often drive the tribals to desperation and even to death. Mining is one such serious issue facing the tribal land. This is one of the biggest threats of atrocities against tribals and to the very existence of tribal population. The primacy in decision making and control is vested in the central government, which can override the local decisions and the territorial control provided by these legislations. The severe deprivation and conflicts caused to the tribals due to the mining in the states of Odisha, Jharkhand, Andhra Pradesh, Goa, etc. are stark examples. For example, all the provisions of the Forest Rights Act and other legislations could not help the struggle of the tribal people of Niyamgiri Hills in Odisha 2010 onwards against an alumina smelting project of a multinational corporate. Scores of tribal people were intimidated, arrested, and cases slapped. Fake encounters and suicides due to state repression were reported. It took several years of struggle and Supreme Court intervention to halt the project. But not all tribals are so successful. There are many such examples from all over the country. Minor forest produce is another serious issue. The law requires the state government to endow the Gram Sabha with the ownership of minor forest produce. This provision is also open to manipulation. For instance, minor forest produce by its definition is separated from the more beneficial forest produce of timber. In some states, profitable forest products such as tendu leaves, sal seeds and so on are reclassified as non-timber forest produce to take them out of the purview of the tribals. We see that wherever the power is vested in the Gram Sabhas, it is done in a manner that the state supremacy remains unchallenged. Coming to minor water bodies, law requires that planning and management of minor water bodies in the scheduled areas shall be entrusted to panchayats. However, the complex web of laws which govern the ownership and management of water resources clearly vest all the control in the hands of the administration at the higher levels. In many states, the term minor water body is not even well defined and therefore remains vague and unenforceable. For example, the Andhra Pradesh and Telangana governments have embarked on an ambitious scheme to take up large irrigation projects. The Polavaram project is expected to submerge approximately 300 villages and displace more than 175,000 people, mostly tribals. While complex debates rage in the High Courts and the Supreme Court regarding grant of environmental clearance, forest approvals and the like, violation of tribal rights has taken a backseat. Prevention of land alienation is one of the most serious issues faced by the tribals. The Constitution requires the states to enact laws for the purpose of empowering Gram Sabhas to prevent alienation of land in the scheduled areas and to restore any unlawfully alienated land of a scheduled tribe. But unauthorized alienation continues in most states. According to a government report, about 3.7 lakh cases of tribal land alienation were registered. Out of the above, about 1.6 lakh cases were disposed of in favor of tribals, whereas about 1.5 lakh cases were rejected on various grounds. This shows an alarming rate of adverse judgments, causing loss and deprivation to the tribes. Urbanization in scheduled areas. Scheduled areas have been encroached upon in the name of development by vested interests in collusion with the political as well as the bureaucratic machinery. Due to the improper application of laws, tribal people are forced out of their lands and they settle in the fringe areas. This creates little pockets of unscheduled areas within scheduled areas. Elections are conducted to the municipal bodies and new areas continue to be urbanized. Mines, real estate development, special economic zones, and tourism development have all encroached upon the tribal land and their livelihood.
So, to conclude, we have seen that there is adequate constitutional and legal provisions to safeguard the interests of tribal land. However, its implementation on ground is the challenge and is often detrimental to the very people it is designed to serve. So there needs to be a major shift in the attitudes and approach of all the stakeholders in order to achieve the desired results.
Respected teacher and my dear friends, I am Agila Lewis from group number 7. My topic is tribal land in Kerala. Tribals in Kerala are the indigenous population found in the southern Indian state of Kerala. Most of the tribal people of Kerala live in the forests and mountains of Western Ghats bordering Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. The native Adivasis of the district belongs to various sects like Paniyas, Kurmas, Adiyars, Kurichas, Oralis, Kutanakans, and Orali Kurmas. They are mostly physically distinguishable with darker skin and sound built physique. They often live in houses made of thatched roof, mud, bamboo, and bricks houses set in swampy valleys and plateaus. Though many of them said to be primitive tribes, all of them have a story of migrations to the hills. It is likely to believe that these tribes were living there for several centuries. The story of tribes on the Western Ghats mountainous ranges have is less than 300 years. Say Philippos Valdiar, who had visited and stayed with several of the tribal groups. Chola Naikan is said to be the most primitive and a vanishing tribe. Discussions with them and the history during the British times, the capture of local kings and their fights have much to reveal about their migrations from the valley to the hills, he says. Read more about Tipu Sultan and Palashi king and learn how some people were lost in the deep forests. The irregular people of Idukki district complained about the heavy tax and they had to pay to the kings, which resulted in their exodus from the Kochi kingdom to that of an animal kingdom. History of British period approved this. In that period, there are many types of tribes are lived in several places in Kerala. The places are Kasargod, Wayanad, Attapadi, Parambikulam, Nilambur, Idukki, Nedumangad, etc. With the realization of freedom of the country in 1947, we the people resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic and to secure a trilogy of justice, social, economic and political to all citizens. The fundamental test of the accomplishment of these preambular objectives is the protection afforded to the weaker section of the society. The tribal people constitute the most depraved lords of the Indian society. In every aspect of life, they are locked in a subhuman standard and are increasingly subjected to feudalistic clause of oppression and capitalistic culture of exploitation. Poverty and deaths due to starvation and diseases resulting from malnutrition are their eternal masters. They have become socially downtrodden, politically marginalized and neglected, and culturally the invariable satellites of others. One of the main causes of this Mukri state of tribal life is the unabated process of land alienation. In Kerala, large-scale alienation of tribal lands had been reported from various parts of the state. This was due to the influence of immigration of plainsmen into tribal areas. This process of immigration has occurred during two phases. The first began under the patronage. Local rulers of the 18th and 19th century who were motivated by reasons quite political. The second phase started in the early 1940s when various parts of Kerala, particularly Malabar, witnessed large-scale exodus of plainsmen from the erstwhile Travancore Cochin region. The inflow of plainsmen affected the man-land ratio in these areas. Large areas of land were alienated from the tribal people and reached the hands of the non-tribals. Large areas of land were alienated from the tribal people and reached the hands of the non-tribals. This process took many forms. In some cases, lands were obtained through the meaning of narcotics and liquor or by paying paltry sums of money at exorbitant rates of interest. In other cases, certain deceptive and aggressive meanings, such as use of force and threat, were the modalities. A lion's share of the lands thus grabbed were laying contagious to watercourses, for just as with the case of every human civilization the world over. The tribal people of Kerala too had understood the importance of settling near river beds and shores and such areas of forests where natural water courses facilitated settled cultivation. As a result of this process, which was operated by members of all religions and overlooked by all political parties and the governments which assumed power in Kerala, the self sufficiency of tribal economically was irretrievably destroyed. The tribal people's symbiotic relation with the nature was wiped out and they were increasingly marginalized as agriculture laborers and put under the consent mercy of a vicious clutches of a synthetic formed by politicians, parochial heads of religions, bureaucrats, and land warning placements. The problem of Adivasi in Kerala are as old as the state. Alienation of land is a serious problem faced by the scheduled tribes. Lands in the mainstream of the tribals, hence they are emotionally attached to it. In post-independent Kerala, large-scale alienation of tribal lands took place. The Adivasis were from time to time being tried to assert their land right. In 1975, the government of Kerala passed an act called Kerala Scheduled Tribe Restriction on Transfer and Restriction on Alienated Land Act to reclaim the Adivasi lands that were encroached by others. In a while, the struggles to get this act implemented marks the beginning of the Adivasi struggles for right to land in Kerala. Another law which was passed in 1971, in 1996 an amended ordinance, was passed by the state government to avoid the KSG Act. However, the President of India didn't accept this. Later, this amendment was passed and the KSG Act was abolished with support of right and left parties alike in the state. The state and established political parties have been continuously avoiding assimilating the tribal unrest in the mainstream. In this context, the tribals started to seek the help of mobilizations and movements to collect their people to fight against marginalization and landlessness. After the formation of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, and resurgence of Adivasi struggles, they faced increased exploitations. When analyzing the recent history of the tribal unrest and their discontent towards the state, the movements and mobilization play a tremendous role. The adoption of new social movements contributes much to articulate the tribal people to fight against their plight of marginalization and landlessness, which would cause them to lose their identity. Displacement for project has resulted in greater landlessness for tribals. There is no reliable and complete information on the number of tribals displaced in the country since independence. The post globalized developmental project and developmental dreams of the state have again made the deprivation of the tribals of Kerala and the developmental projects and developmental dreams of the state have again made the deprivation of the tribals of Kerala and the developmental divide has increased between the tribal and non-tribal in the state. Kerala holds a distinctive position in the tribal map of India. Most of the tribes of Kerala state belongs to famous family group of Dravidians. But unfortunately, the tribal people in Kerala have been marginalized and oppressed by various political and social factors and forces. The policies and schemes implemented by successive governments at the center and the state are far from their sight and power. They haven't organizational strength and bargaining power to act as strong pressure group in Kerala politics. Therefore, the government should take steps towards developmental activities in all grounds, including provisions for water supply, bus service, and roads, constitute a special land tribunal to rectify the grievances related to land alienations and prevention of any further alienation of Adivasi lands. Ensure that the Adivasis have full and complete control over their lands and its produce, and various insidious practices of non-Adivasis to take control of the land and their produce should be dealt with family. Thank you.
In this section, we are discussing about the acts relating to tribal land. There are three important acts relating to tribal land. First one is Kerala Scheduled Tribes Act 1975, and the second one is Implementation of Kerala State Restriction in Transfer of Lands and Restoration of Alienated Land Act 1999, and the third one is Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act 2006. We know that the tribal people constitute the most deprived lots of Indian society. In every aspect of life, they are locked in a subhuman standard and are increasingly subjected to feudalistic laws of oppression and capitalistic culture of exploitation. Poverty and deaths due to starvation and diseases resulting from malnutrition are their eternal masters. They have become socially downtrodden, politically marginalized, and neglected, and culturally the invariable satellites of others. One of the main causes of this murky state of tribal life is the unabated process of land alienation. In Kerala, large-scale alienation of tribal lands had been reported from various parts of the states. The different governments which came to power in Kerala after 1961 loved to doom themselves in a state of concerted Ripon-Winkleyan sleep over the report and woke up only in 1975 to make a legislation, namely the Kerala Scheduled Tribes Act 1975. The Kerala Scheduled Tribes Act 1975 enacted for restricting the transfer of lands by the members of scheduled tribes in the state of Kerala, and also for the restoration of possession of lands alienated by them. It extends to the whole of the state of Kerala, though it seemed expedient for the restriction of transfer of land and its restoration. Accordingly, the transfer was in relation to the immovable property, and it means an act either written or through oral transaction. The property is conferred by way of mortgage, sale, lease, gift, exchange, or other manners that includes a charge on payment of consideration, or else is a voluntary surrender. There are certain exceptions to the Act wherein the Act does not include the lease of any land or building granted by the Administrator General or other officials, the mortgage or pledge of property as a government security, or any loans by the members of the scheduled tribes, or any mortgage or pledge of property in favor of security for any loans to the cooperative society or a nationalized bank and not to a private agency or moneylender. The Act applied for the restriction on transfer of lands described in Section 4, which means, in spite of other laws, any transfer of immovable property which was possessed or owned by the member of scheduled tribes on or after the commencement of the Act to a person other than a member of scheduled tribes would be invalid. When the transfer of immovable property was invalid as per Section 4 and 5 of the Act, the member of scheduled tribes is entitled to the restoration of possession of such property. Notwithstanding the things mentioned in Section 6, Section 7 of the Act gives the government the authority to direct the person in possession or enjoyment of any immovable property to deliver its possession to a member of scheduled tribes. If after further inquiries found that the former was deprived of its possession or enjoyment as per Section 4 and 5 of the Act, the liability to prove the validity of transfer of immovable property lie on the person who claims such a transfer to be valid according to Section 8 of the Act. Then, as per Section 13, any person who on or after commencement of the Act transfer any immovable property in contravention of the Section 4 of the Act shall be punishable with a rigorous imprisonment for a term of 1 year or with a fine of rupees 2000 or with the both. Next, we discuss about the second act, implementation of Kerala State Restriction in Transfer of Lands and Restoration of Alienated Land Act 1999. This scheme is to help the ST population to get the benefits provided under the Transfer of Lands and Restoration of Alienated Land Act 1999. The Act provides for restricting the transfer of lands by members of scheduled tribes in the state and for the restoration of possession of lands alienated by such members and for matters connected therewith. The outlay is for restoration of alienated land and development activities in the land, infrastructure, facilities, etc. The most important act in this topic is Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act 2006. The Forest Rights Act 2006 recognizes the rights of forest dwelling tribal communities and other traditional forest dwellers to forest resources on which these communities were dependent for a variety of needs, including livelihood, habitation, and other socio-cultural needs. The forest management policies, including the acts, rules, and forest policies of participatory forest management policies in both colonial and post-colonial India, did not, till the enactment of this act, recognizes the symbiotic relationship of the STs with the forest, reflected in their dependence on the forest as well as in their traditional wisdom regarding conservation of the forest. The act encompasses rights of self-cultivation and habitation, which are usually regarded as individual rights, and community rights as grazing, fishing, and access to water bodies in forest, habitat rights for PVTGs, traditional seasonal resources, access of nomadic and pastoral community, access to biodiversity, community right to intellectual property and traditional knowledge, recognition of traditional customary rights, and right to protect, regenerate, or conserve or manage any community forest resource for sustainable use. It also provides rights to allocation of forest land for development purposes to fulfill basic infrastructural needs of the community. In conjunction with the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, Rehabilitation and Settlement Act 2013, Forest Rights Act protects the tribal population from eviction without rehabilitation and settlement. The Act further enjoins upon the Gram Sabha and rights holders the responsibility of conservation and protection of biodiversity, wildlife, forest, adjoining catchment areas, water sources, and other ecological sensitive areas, as well as to stop any destructive practices affecting these resources or cultural and natural heritage of the tribals. The Gram Sabha is also a highly empowered body under the Act, enabling the tribal population to have a decisive say in the determination of local policies and schemes impacting them. Thus, the Act encompasses the forest dwellers to access and use the forest resources in the manner that they were traditionally accustomed to protect, conserve, and manage forests, protect forest dwellers from unlawful evictions, and also provides for basic development facilities for the community. For the community of forest dwellers to access facilities of education, health, nutrition, infrastructure, etc. The Forest Rights Act states that whereas the forest rights on ancestral lands and their habitat were not adequately recognized in the consolidation of state forests during the colonial period, as well as in independent India, resulting in historical injustice to the forest dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers who are integral to the very survival and sustainability of the forest ecosystem. So we can sum up with that the main objective of this act is to undo the historical injustice occurred to the forest dwelling communities, and the second one is to ensure land tenure, livelihood and food security of the forest dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers, and the third one is to strengthen the conservation regime of the forest by including the responsibilities and authority on forest rights holders for sustainable use, conservation of biodiversity and maintenance of ecological balance. The Section 3 of the Act has conferred 13 forest rights to the forest dwellers. These rights include a right to hold and live in forest, right to ownership, access to collect, use and dispose of forest produce which has been traditionally collected. Section 4 of the Act has specifically recognized that if the indigenous or tribal people are living in critical wildlife habitats of national parks and sanctuaries and they are to be shifted, such migration or shifting will not be allowed unless first one is resettlement or alternative package has been prepared and communicated that provides a secure livelihood, and the second one is free informed consent of Gram Sabha of area for the proposed resettlement has been obtained in writing, and the third one is the facilities and land allocation at the resettlement location have been completed as per promised package. Further, once such a settlement takes place, there shall be no subsequent diversion from that place.
Respected teachers and my dear friends, I am Jayadevan. As a member of group number 7, I will talk about the topic intensity of tribal land problems. Issues related to tribes started with colonial era and still remains in independent India as one of the hardest nut to crack. When we go through history, we can find that there have been many uprisings of tribes from the time of rule of company and to that of people. Most of the time, apple of discord is found out to be land in these unfortunate events. At the time of independence, Indian government inherited a large tribal population. The government of India has made number of plans to protect the rights of tribals and to integrate them into the national developmental planning. The Minority Commission, National Human Rights Commission, etc. are there to prevent atrocities against them and to bring their plight to the national limelight. Above all, in the Constitution of India, the tribals were explicitly recognized and clauses were included to permit positive discrimination in their favor. However, it is to be noted that scheduled tribes remain one of the most vulnerable, most impoverished, and most displaced of all groups in India. 47.1% of all STs in rural areas are below poverty line as compared to 33.8% for the national average, where 28.8% of all STs in urban areas are below poverty line as compared to 20.9% for the national average. In spite of being the only group with constitutional protections for their land rights, 9.4% of scheduled tribes are landless compared to 7.4% for the national average, while STs constitute only 8.6% of total population. It is estimated that they constitute 40% of all people who have been displaced during the period 1951 to 1990, some more than once. Due to the construction of dams, mines, industrial development, and creation of wildlife parks and sanctuaries, only 24.7% of ST population that was displaced during this period was rehabilitated. Out of many problems faced by tribes in India regarding life, livelihood, and land alienation, forest loss, mining and related loss, environmental damage and destruction of livelihood are major ones that threatens tribal lands of India. Land alienation is a process through which the tribals lose or sell their lands to non-tribals with the loss of ownership of traditional lands to others. They lose their livelihood and identity. scheduled tribes have by large enjoyed traditional and customary rights over vast swaths of land. However, the process of recognition of traditional rights of scheduled tribes to land is significantly uneven and incomplete. Over time, the state and non-tribals have deprived them the access of their lands by appropriation of these lands of the recorded land rights despite constitutional and legislative safeguards at the central and state level. Land alienation has been widespread. In compliance of the fifth schedule, most states have enacted legislation restricting or prohibiting the transfer of land from tribals to non-tribals in scheduled areas. However, these legislations have not been able to fulfill constitutional objective of ensuring that tribals retain control over their homelands. Even though most litigants which approach the courts met a positive result, it is still true that these laws rely heavily upon their activation by the affected parties, and the number of cases which are actually activated in courts are a mere tip of iceberg. According to the report of Department of Land Resources, Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India in July 2013, 3.75 lakh cases of tribal land alienation were registered, covering 8.55 lakh acres of land. Out of the above, 1.62 lakh cases were disposed of in the favor of tribals, covering a total area of 4.47 lakh acres. 1.55 lakh cases covering an area of 3.63 lakh acres were rejected by the courts on various grounds. It is also noteworthy that the aforesaid numbers have not changed at all since a previous report prepared by the same department in 2005. At that time, 57,521 cases involving 0.44 lakh acres of land were pending in various courts of the country. But the present status of pendency of such cases is not known. Where the tribals do retain possession and control over their traditional lands in resistance to market forces, it is the power of eminent domain of the Indian state which poses greatest threat. The power of eminent domain of state has unfortunately been interpreted both in jurisprudence and as well as in policy to mean the power to forcibly acquire private property to any use it sees as appropriate. The 12th five-year plan document acknowledges this fact as follows. Tribal populations have been disproportionately targeted, displacing them from their lands and livelihood as their resources have been seized and diverted in the name of larger common good. At least at 55% of all displaced people are tribals, and in states like Gujarat, the proportion is 76%. Indian forest laws were founded on parent statute, the Colonial Indian Forest Act 1927. Purpose of the British law behind words is to facilitate better management of Indian forests towards unhindered exploitation of timber. Toward this end, colonial state asserted its ownership and control over forests and all resources subsumed in them, riding roughshod over the traditional forest dwelling communities and their traditional methods of use, conservation and access. The Forest Conservation Act 1980 and the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, while purporting to be based on more modern goals of conservation and environmental protection, continue to use colonial forest law architecture as their foundation, thereby reinforcing its entrenchment. Thus, the approach continued to be based on statutory classifications, often forced and exclusionary approach supported by legal sanctions, often in the form of criminal offences. The result was expropriation and denial of rights. As per data submitted to the Supreme Court in 2005, 60% of sanctuaries and 62% of national parks had not even completed the required process of right settlement, though many had been declared more than 2 decades ago. Mining. Mining represents one of the most serious threats to the lives, livelihoods, and homelands of tribal communities in India. And it is this threat that has most aggressively tested constitutional framework relating to scheduled areas. While official data does not quantify the amount of mining that take place in scheduled tribe areas or the number of scheduled tribes affected in the process, some estimates of the extent and impacts of mining tribals have been made. One report estimates that out of 4,175 mines in the country in 1991, 3,500 were in Adivasi areas. While minerals found in Adivasi areas reportedly contributed more than half of national mining production, another estimate states that between 1950 and 1991, at least 20 lakh people were displaced by mining projects, of whom only 25% received any resettlement whatsoever. Of these displaced, an estimated 52% were STs. Official estimates of these numbers are unavailable. The report goes on to observe that existing legal instruments for the protection of Adivasi rights are simply ignored by government agencies in many mining projects. As we can see from the map, most of the mining sites are located in the areas comes under 5th schedule states: Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra and Odisha. We can also infer from the map that, except for the state of Tamil Nadu, resources of great national importance like uranium, petroleum, where related land acquisition laws are more stringent, which were depicted by pink colored markings in the map, are solely located in 5th and 6th scheduled states. Environmental damage and destruction of livelihoods. Tribal communities have also undergone more than any other community in the country unprecedented environmental devastation of their lands and resources by rampant industrialization, leaving these resources destroyed or degraded. Desertification and destruction of water resources. Overuse of water resources, both underground and overground, is rampant in many of the industrial and mining clusters of the country. Iron ore mining, for instance, used 77 million tons of water in 2005 and 2006, much of it in Adivasi areas. This amount of water would be sufficient for the needs of 3 million people. Similarly, the controversial Coca-Cola plant in Plachimada, Kerala, released toxic effluents in the fertilizer in a fertile agricultural area, while draining groundwater table. Indeed, the company sold its waste material to the local farmers as fertilizer. The Adivasis around the plant found their wells polluted with toxins, forcing them to depend on water a few kilometers away. They eventually mounted a protest. Pollution is another form of environmental destruction through air, water, land, and soil pollution that accompanies mining and industrial projects, despite the fact that such pollution is supposed to be taken into account during environmental impact assessment process. In practice, it is rarely accounted for in planning and even more rarely addressed after the projects came up. Maintenance and countermeasures against even deadly pollution are extremely poor. In one example, the Jadugoda uranium mine, the largest source of uranium in India, has seen its tailings pipeline burst no less than 4 times between 2006 and 2008. This has spread radioactive waste among Adivasi communities of the area. Despite a complex system of environmental laws and jurisprudence that is meant to address such issues, in practice, the forums and institutions meant to enforce these principles are inaccessible to marginalized communities in general and to Adivasis in particular. The state pollution control boards, which were set up to enforce pollution laws, tended to be inaccessible and unaccountable and prone to lethargy and unless provided by specific court orders.
Hello ma'am, hello all. My name is Anushri and I am assigned with the conclusion part of the topic tribal lands. As we have seen, there have been several laws and legislations to protect tribal land and land rights over the period of time post-independence. The Constitution of India makes special provisions for socio-economic development of the tribal groups. However, in practice, tribal land alienation and loss of habitat and livelihood still continues in different states of India. The state has followed the colonial legacies and is trying to suppress tribal voice through various measures such as land acquisition, registering false cases, branding as Maoist, etc., which is very crucial in the name of peace, development, and democracy. Tribals have raised their voice and have organized movements to claim their rights over land, water, and forest resources as far as their life, livelihood, freedom, and identity are concerned. In many states, such as Kerala, after the implementation of land reform legislations, tribal people found themselves losing their land and becoming mere laborers. The Adivasis have from time to time tried to assert their land rights but were brutally crushed by unleashing the state violence, as at Chingeri 1995 and Panavalli 1997, Muttanga and Chengara. The celebrated Kerala model of development has not made much change for the socio-economic life from all parts of the country. Without solving the real problem of the tribals, the state has been found waging war against its own people. Therefore, after 70 years of India's independence, tribals remain underdeveloped and impoverished with a lack of freedom, rights, and dignity. To overcome the challenges, all the stakeholders need to come together and work towards a more positive intended approach. Dedicated legal support such as special land tribunal for speedy redressal of the grievances related to land alienations and prevention of any further alienation of tribal lands ensure that the Adivasis have full and complete control over their lands and its produce. Exploitation through land alienation, industrialization, corporate profiteering, harassment, and physical violence, etc., should be brought under control. Tribals should be enabled to preserve their culture and lifestyle as much as possible with minimum external interference. On the other hand, steps should be taken in a progressive manner to encourage the tribals to give up bad traditions, and the desire for education should be generated among them. The government should speed up developmental activities including provisions for water supply and modern agricultural techniques. The tribal farmers should be provided agricultural training in agricultural camps, and such camps should be arranged in tribal areas at Panchayat Samiti level. And for the economic upliftment of tribals, it is necessary to promote the allied activities to the agricultural cultivation such as poultry farms, goat and sheep farms, dairy development, etc. The mere financial allocation will not be sufficient for all-round development of tribals. It is necessary to change their attitude toward problems. Measures should be encouraged to make them independent, courageous, and live with self-respect. Above all, tribal representation should be increased in the political system of every state, and these measures will help them to join the mainstream of the nation along with others and will enable a balanced development of the nation. So, as part of the conclusion, we could say, thus for tribals and tribal areas, many things have been done, many are being done, but many more need to be done. Thank you.